Good evening and welcome to The World Today. Our studio guest is Hannes Hofbauer, a leading progressive intellectual in Austria and one of the few, if not the only, progressive publishers in that country. We're going to be discussing Austria, once the center of the great Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire, one of the big imperial states of Europe, brought down by the First World War after the defeat inflicted on the alliance of Germany, Austria, Turkey, etc. Many empires fell, including this one. Then came the Anschluss, which was effectively the takeover of Austria by the Third Reich in Germany, who were uniting the German lands all over Europe. They did the same in Sudetenland, in Czechoslovakia, etc. And it has to be said that many Austrians at that time favored the Anschluss with Germany, and it's relevant today because of the political situation which erupted last year with a coalition of the traditional right-wing conservatives now moving even further to the right under Sebastian Kurz, popularized in the European media as a celeb because he was the youngest leader of any European country, and good wishes were exchanged with the Irish and other countries on this basis. But together with him in the coalition was the Freedom Party, whose origins lie in the immediate post-war independence of Austria, when it was a party created by former Nazi officers to keep most of the old Nazi support inside their ranks. Then in 2000, when once again the Freedom Party was taken into a coalition, the European Union got very huffy, upset, threatened sanctions against Austria, threatened to boycott Austria, and all this huffing and puffing didn't last longer than basically a few weeks. Everything that ended. This time, with the Freedom Party having an even more explicit right-wing agenda, there's been silence from the European Union, and they're treating it as they would any other party. One of the more shocking things appeared in the social networks not so long ago. Whether it's true or fake news, we will ask our guest in a minute, of kosher meat, and the caption underneath it, some local politicians want Jews to show their identity cards before they walk into the shops. I can hardly believe this because it's such a stupid, provocative idea. And why should they do it when they're not that hostile to Israel as a state at the moment, the European far right, by and large? Hannes, let's start with this question of unless they integrate into Austrian culture. What do these people mean by Austrian culture?
Yeah, that's a very funny question because, in fact, there is no Austrian culture. Historically, as you said, it was the culture of an empire where many different people lived, Slavic people, Hungarian people, Italian people, German-speaking people. And after that, Austria in 1918 was founded as German Austria, and it was only the Allies who didn't allow Austria to be German Austria. So we turned into Republic of Austria in 1919, after Paris only allowed us to be Austria as a republic without the German Anschluss idea. And now to speak of Austrian identity today, it's a very different thing. What the right wing mean is speaking German, because there is the problem of immigration, people who don't speak German. Yeah. And your example that people have to show their passport, if Jewish or Muslim passport or whatever, if they want to eat animal halal meat, That was really mentioned by a right-wing politician in Lower Austria, but immediately afterward, we have to say, even the government, or not even the government, said that's not a good idea. So that was a sort of a very bad joke.
But you know, this is, it's interesting. You have a politician from this coalition who says something completely vulgar and stupid and beyond belief, and then the government says, no, it's not a good idea, and people then say, the government is being sensible, when in fact the whole political battleground is now controlled by the right and the far right.
Yeah.
So everything has become relative.
That's true, but this specific idea, together with other right-wing ideas, aim at Muslims. So we are in that moment, I would say Austria is very anti-Muslim, not Austria as a people, not Austria as the left-wing people or whoever, social democrats, they are not anti-Muslim, but the right-wing is anti-Muslim. We have many different laws aiming at Muslim culture, at Islam. We have a special Islamic law introduced 2 years ago.
What does that say?
That say, for instance, that the Quran is only valuable if it is a German Quran, if you have to write it in German language, which is crazy. Yeah? Then they want to have control over Islam groups. And the most dangerous thing, to my mind, is they forbid foreign payment for Islam mosques, for instance. So if there is a Turkish imam who is paid by Turkey or by any other group, even if he is paid by a German Muslim group, he will be extradited, and he will be, and that already happened. So we have the phenomenon that we have a really anti-Muslim law since 3 years.
But Hannes, thinking about this historically now, a lot of the stuff that used to be said about the Jews in the 20s and 30s particularly, not to mention the 40s, is now being said about Muslims. They're not part of our culture, they have their own habits, their religion is completely different, etc. It's now being said about the Muslims in Austria, and of course this is not simply an Austrian phenomenon. It exists in different parts of Europe. But in Austria and Holland as well, the degree of Islamophobia is quite shocking, really, and out of control.
Yeah, you're right, and it's in a way historically ironic, because Austria was partly a Muslim country when the Austrian-Hungarian Empire annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina before the First World War. There were liberal religious laws at that time, and now we have a restrictive law.
According to legend, when the Ottoman armies of the Ottoman Empire were at the gates of Vienna, Austrian bakers were evidently making pastries in the shape of the cross, in the shape of the crescent, yeah. Which later became known as a croissant, because they were getting ready to welcome the new invaders of Austria. Yeah. So from that to now, we've moved in a curious way backwards, which is amazing, you know, the way in which history moves, of course.
Yeah. We have the special crescent Christmas bakery since, I would say, 17th century, maybe.
Yeah. Since the 17th century, yes.
Yeah, but this anti-Muslim movement, which reaches far into the liberal right, not only the extreme right, even in social democrat circles, I would say, is based, or is not based, but is somehow connected with the idea to help Israel. Yeah? And therefore, this is a very stupid mixture. And for instance, the Freedom Party found itself on this level and hopes to be accepted by Israel, by the right in Israel. Yeah?
Which they will be.
They will be, and they all visit, there are visits between them. But that's a dangerous situation, I would say.
I mean, this is particularly ironic in the case of Austria, because under the long years of the chancellorship of Bruno Kreisky, in the 70s in particular, he was one of the few European politicians who came out publicly, despite his own background as a Jew and his awareness of what had happened in the Judeo-side of the Second World War in his own country. He was very sharp on the question of Palestine, invited Yasser Arafat to actually visit Palestine, welcomed him, greeted him. And at that time, Austrian social democracy on this particular question of Israel-Palestine was, in my opinion, the most advanced in Europe.
Yeah, that's true. But the non-transatlantic politicians in the Democratic Party at the time, Ministry of Inner Affairs, Foreign Affairs, and Traffic, I remember 3 of them, they were kicked out not by force or something like that, but step by step out of the party. And today you have in the Social Democratic Party, I would say, only a handful of non-transatlantic people who have something to say. Yeah. That was a transformation process which took place since the middle of the 80s.
So this process came with the sort of beginnings of the collapse of the Soviet Union and that whole world, that people began to readjust. But let's now discuss the actual political trajectory in Austria. Yes.
May I add one positive thing of Austrian foreign policy now is that Austrian politics don't follow the Russophobian side. Yeah? So we have a foreign ministry which was nominated by the Freedom Party, but she's not a member. I know her personally, she's not the right wing, in fact. Yeah? And also before, the Conservative Party, the Christian Democrats, they refused, together with the Social Democrats, I would say, everybody, to follow this Russophobian politics, which is very prominently active in Germany, for instance, and in Britain especially. Yeah. So we didn't kick out Russian diplomats, for instance, after this affair that took place.
Well, it helps not being a member of NATO.
That is it, yeah.
I'm amazed there isn't more pressure to integrate Austria in NATO. I think it's the only European Union state which is not in NATO.
It's not a thing to be proud of, not to be in NATO, but it's it's a positive thing.
No, it is positive, because it means that you're not automatically forced to take part in wars decided in Washington, where most of these wars are decided, and send Austrian troops to go and fight everywhere. Hannes, now let's come to the recent events in Austrian politics. Here you've had a right-wing party which openly was created by former Nazi military officers and others. You've had the collapse of social democracy, really, in many ways, and you have now what is being referred to before the Italian election results as the most right-wing government in Europe.
You're sure? I mean, workers in Austria don't believe the Social Democrats anymore, because they made many faults. They turned into liberal, like Tony Blair. So there was an open space in terms of whom to vote. And the right wing used this space, and they turned these critics on migration against the migrants, against the victims. And that gave them something like almost 30%.
Just the anti-immigrant campaigns.
That was very important, because you remember this 2015 migration wave.
Yes,
they call it. There were about 1 million point something people running through Austria. They used this migration theme. And then they also mentioned some social politics. We realized that the Freedom Party is going into liberal direction, very dramatically. Yeah? even now they passed a law that entrepreneur allowed to employ people for 12 hours a day, 60 hours a week. This is 100 years ago that we had this. Yeah, it's really true.
So it's a 12-hour working day is now legalized?
It's now legalized. It will start the 1st of September this year, and it could happen 5 days a week. So this is a total reversal, and this is, to my mind, a bit a chance for the left. And the unions already made a manifestation 10 days ago, of 3 weeks ago, with 100,000 people attending. That was a very strong reaction, because they mobilized within 10 days or even less.
Law being passed.
Yeah. So that is only one of the examples how the Freedom Party turned into liberal. Yeah? And on the other way, the Christian Conservative Party with Sebastian Kurz, the so-called People's Party, he made an authoritarian curve, yeah? Like Macron with his new movement. Kurz stayed with the old party. This old party still existing, but he said, I am the one who will choose everybody who goes to parliament. Yeah?
Like Macron.
It's like Macron.
That's his model, is Macron.
Yeah, it was his model. Yeah. So we have the phenomenon that the very far right turn into liberal, economically, socially, and the Christian Democrats,
becoming more authoritarian.
Becoming authoritarian and are liberal anyhow.
Yeah. So and in this situation, what are the currents on the left? I mean, in Germany, you know, with all its problems, you have the left party. In France, you have Mélenchon. In Britain, you have Corbyn, actually now leading the Labour Party. Italy is dead at the moment, as far as any movement to the left is concerned. They've gone. Maybe something will arise soon. We shall see. In Spain, you have Podemos and anti-capitalist currents within Podemos. So in most countries, there is something. But in Austria, there were the Greens, which were not so left, but which seem to have disappeared.
Yeah, they disappeared because they were kicked out of parliament by the voters. They are no more in parliament. No, nowadays I would say the unions are the ones who are driven by this topic, 12 working hours a day.
Doesn't it breach EU laws?
Nobody talked about this. And if not, we will know by EU court in 3 years, maybe. No, yeah. It is not that they say it's voluntarily, yeah. But anybody who works under bad conditions know that if the entrepreneur asks you to work 12 hours a day, you can maybe say 1 time, 2 times, not this time. But if you say it all the time, he will
kick you out.
I mean, this is how it works voluntarily.
But the irony here, Hannes, is that the people who do usually agree to work long hours are migrant workers because they are desperate for needs of their own.
Yeah, yeah.
And these people have been campaigning against migrants. And in fact, it's those workers who might accept, for bad reasons, but understandable reasons, the need to work a 12-hour day. So it could be, given the strangeness of all this, that the trade unions, campaigns and mobilization could pull working class voters away from the far right.
Yeah, I would say that's a really good chance.
But then what would be the instrument the trade unions would use? All they have so far is the Social Democrats, who've been a disaster.
I mean, I attended this huge manifestation, and I was really impressed by not only how many people, but that the people came from all different political parts. Even the conservative unionists from Tyrol and from the Alps. The Alps people are always a bit different. Yeah, they came to Vienna protesting against what their own party made to be a law. Yeah. And you asked me about other left-wing left-wing possibilities, yeah? And I have to say that the Communist Party, can't say it's not existing, but it's very weak. Also, we have a special case in the southern part of Austria, in Styria, in Graz, which is the second city.
Graz had a communist member of parliament, didn't it?
Not in the last 30 years.
About 20 years.
Yeah, that is true, yeah. And now they have in this region 6-7%, and in the Graz town 20% communist voters, yeah, and that is very much attached to their political program. They care for people who look for housing, for jobless people. So they make left-wing basic work. Yeah. I would say this is also a model. On the one hand, to fight in a campaign against these anti-social laws of the right-wing parties. And on the other hand, you have to make basic work on for housing, jobless people, and things like that.
Discussing more broader questions, that the Anschluss carried out by the Third Reich was, as I said earlier, popular with a large section of Austrians, but that all came to an end. But effectively today, economically and even culturally, in terms of ownership, publishing houses, large bookstores, etc., are owned by German companies. So the German state is a very dominant player in Austria on many levels.
German enterprises, yeah, they own almost everything. In fact, I did my thesis on this topic, how Austria turned into the West, into German influence in the war after '38, after the Anschluss, and afterward it continued somehow. Yeah? And I remember even the data that before the war, Austrian enterprises were owned by 6-8% German owners. And afterwards, it was 60 or 65%. With banks, it was even more.
So, hang on, during the Anschluss?
The Anschluss made Austria German, yeah, in economic terms, totally, yeah. In industry, in banking sector, in publishing sector. And that didn't change much afterwards, yeah, because it was a good relation for the owners. Yeah. They just enlarged their market. It's the same language spoken. So we have today the phenomenon that all the papers, more or less, in Austria, the daily papers, they have their own names, sure. They keep their own names, but they are owned by German big companies. And you don't have, for instance, a left-wing newspaper in Austria. Yeah? That's a pity. I mean, it's a catastrophe.
There is no left-wing daily paper.
There is no left-wing daily paper. For 8 million people, I would say it wouldn't be very necessary, but at least we should have something weekly or something like that. But yeah, we haven't. Yeah? We have good and interesting internet magazines, things like that. But also they are more concentrated on world policy, not so much on Austrian inner affairs. So the left has a very bad stand to somehow reflect what is going on from day to day in the government, in the economic sphere. Yeah.
Let me ask you a slightly provocative question. If there were a referendum in Austria asking Austrian citizens whether they are happy being an independent state or whether they would be prepared to merge voluntarily with the German Republic?
No to German Republic, sure. I mean, that wasn't even under Hitler. It was quite divided, I would say. Yeah, the conception of being German or not German. Hitler hated Vienna, for instance, because he said that's a Slavic city, can't play with these people. Yeah. So I would say that is clear that Austrians would vote against being Germans. Yeah. The other thing is to vote, to have a vote to leave the European Union. I would say that's not so clear.
Oh.
Maybe today they wouldn't vote for leaving. Yeah.
Well, both the far right and the Sebastian Kurz publicly stated that they were pro-Europe after they won the election, so as not to worry the EU bureaucracy too much. But what about the base?
For Kurz's base, for the basis of the conservative right wing, they are pro-European. For the Freedom Party, it's hard to say. Yeah, it's not people. They are quite easily being manipulated, I would say. Yeah.
It can be surprising. I mean, no one in this country thought, in Britain, that Leave would win.
But coming back to skepticism on European Union in Austria, the difference compared to Great Britain would be that here in the United Kingdom there is a strong national capital.
Yes.
Compared to Austria. As I said, there is almost no national capital in Austria. There is a bit, yeah.
But German capital rules Austria.
And the Austrian capital is very linked to the German capital. For instance, our car makers, they all produce cars or parts of cars for the German market, for the German car producers. Yeah? We are a car producing country, but there's no Austrian car. Yeah? So this gives the idea how it functions. So we have not people like there are in Great Britain. They were pro-Leave because of national capital interest.
Yes, though it has to be said that the bulk of the English financial elite, in particular, were,
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
They were very strongly for Remain.
Yeah.
And they still are.
Yeah.
So what does the future hold for a state like Austria? Let's look forward. Let's look 20, 30 years forward, Hannes. What will this country be? I mean, how can it resist a merger with the German state?
I mean, we have to be realistic. It depends very much on what is happening around us, Austria. It depends very much what is happening in Germany, in Italy, and a bit in Hungary. Yeah? And there's different visions for these countries. So I wouldn't say that Austria, as a very small country, is able to create a future on its own. And the left also is very attached to the German left, for instance. Me personally, I write for German left-wing papers. Yeah? Besides my publishing work. So we have to discuss this in a broader sense. And coming back to what Austria is now touching the most is these new laws on work, on work regulations and working hours. I would say there is a good chance for the union to somehow get their feet on the ground again, because they lost ground very much in the past years. And also for young people. And on the other hand, on the geopolitical or worldwide scale, I would say Austria is in a way a bridge, could be a more bridge than it is today, and it is still a bridge between East and West, and not between Europe and the Arab world, no more. But between East and West, like in Kreisky times, it could attend this position again. And the left, as I said, to somehow make basic work, campaigning for workers and basic work for people who are jobless or people who have problems with housing.
Hannes Hofbauer, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tariq.